June 7th, 1944, Omaha Beach, Normandy. The pale dawn light reveals a scene from hell. The channel tide, once clear, is now a frothing pink, lapping against steel obstacles and the silent, tangled forms of the fallen. The air, still thick with the smell of cordite and salt, now carries a new, more sinister scent, the coppery tang of blood. On the sand and the bluffs beyond, thousands of men lie wounded. They are the survivors of the D-Day landings, but their survival is precarious. For many, the fight is no longer against German machine guns. It is against the slow, insidious drain of shock from blood loss. They are bleeding to death on the very ground they had just heroically captured. Standard medical protocol for a severe battle wound was clear, established by the High Command of the Allied Medical Corps. A wounded soldier would receive basic first aid at the front, a tourniquet, a sulfa powder packet sprinkled into the wound, a morphine syringe for the pain. He would then be carried by stretcher bearers to an aid station just behind the lines. There, a medic or junior medical officer would stabilize him further. If his condition was critical, he would be marked for immediate evacuation to field hospital, often miles from the front, or even to a hospital ship off the coast. It was at these more established facilities, with their sterile environments and trained surgical teams, that blood transfusions were deemed safe and appropriate. The logic was rooted in pre-war medicine. Transfusions were a complex, risky procedure. The blood had to be typed and cross-matched to avoid fatal reactions. It required refrigeration, specialized equipment, and a clean environment to prevent contamination and deadly infections. To the medical bureaucrats in London and Washington, the chaos of a forward aid post with its mud, dust, and overwhelming numbers of casualties was the absolute worst place to attempt such a delicate operation. The orders were unequivocal: no whole blood transfusions forward of the field hospital. The risk of killing a patient with the wrong blood type or a massive infection was considered too great. But on the ground in Normandy, this protocol was a death sentence. The evacuation chain was broken, stretched to its absolute limit by the sheer scale of the carnage. Jeeps converted into ambulances bogged down in the thick Norman mud. Roads were blocked with military traffic or under shell fire. The journey from the front line to a hospital that could administer blood could take hours, sometimes an entire day. For a soldier in profound shock from hemorrhaging, that was a journey he would never complete. Men with wounds that were survivable, a torn femoral artery, a shredded spleen, were succumbing not to the injury itself, but to the irreversible collapse of their circulatory system. They were dying in the back of jolting ambulances, on the floors of overcrowded tents, and on the stretchers where they had been placed, waiting for a ride that would come too late. They were dying for lack of a pint or two of blood, a resource that was, ironically, available in abundance from the healthy soldiers all around them. One man who witnessed this bureaucratic tragedy unfolding was Captain John Forrester, a 38-year-old surgeon from Boston assigned to a forward aid station with the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One. Forrester was not a career military man. He had been a promising trauma surgeon at Massachusetts General Hospital, renowned for his steady hands and his unorthodox, sometimes brazen, approaches to saving lives. He had volunteered for service, believing his skills would be of most use where the fighting was thickest. Now, standing in a sweltering, canvas-walled tent just 2 miles from the front line near Colville-sur-Mer, he felt a profound and growing fury. His aid station was overwhelmed. The air was thick with the groans of the wounded and the frantic, clipped voices of his medics. He moved from stretcher to stretcher, doing what he could, clamping bleeders, cleaning wounds, administering plasma. Plasma, the liquid component of blood with the cells removed, was the official solution for shock in the field. It was lyophilized, stored in powder form in glass bottles, and could be reconstituted with sterile water. It didn't require refrigeration and had a long shelf life. It was safe, as it carried no blood type. But Forrester knew its critical limitation. Plasma could expand blood volume, but it could not carry oxygen. A soldier who had lost a massive amount of red blood cells needed those oxygen carriers back. Without them, plasma was like trying to reinflate a tire by pouring in more air without patching the hole. It might hold for a moment, but the fundamental deficit remained. He watched young men, pale as marble, their pulses thready and weak, receive bottle after bottle of plasma, only to fade away anyway. Their bodies were simply starved for oxygen. They were drowning in air. The breaking point came on the morning of June 8th. A young lieutenant from Iowa was carried in, a piece of shrapnel having torn open his thigh and severed a major artery. The field tourniquet had staunched the flow, but not before he had lost a catastrophic amount of blood. He was conscious, but just barely, his skin cold and clammy. "Hang on, son," Forrester had said, his voice low and calm. "We're getting you out of here." He had ordered an immediate evacuation and started a plasma drip. He watched the Jeep ambulance bounce away down the rutted track, its red cross stark against the green landscape. 3 hours later, the same Jeep returned. The driver, a kid no older than 19, met Forrester's eyes, his own filled with a hollow exhaustion. "He didn't make it, Doc," he said quietly. "Died before we even got to the junction. There was just nothing left of him." Forrester stood there, his hands, still stained with the blood of other men, clenched into fists at his sides. The lieutenant had not died from his wound. He had died from a lack of blood, a commodity that was, at that very moment, pumping through the veins of every healthy soldier in the camp. He had died because of a rule. That night, in the flickering light of a kerosene lantern, Forrester made a decision that would either save thousands or end his career and potentially kill patients. He was going to perform direct, uncross-matched blood transfusions right here in his forward aid station. He was going to break medical orders. He called his small team together, 2 junior medics, Corporal Miller and Private Evans, and his head nurse, Lieutenant Anna Rosenberg, a no-nonsense woman from Philadelphia who had seen nearly as much death as he had. He laid out his plan with a chilling clarity. "The current system is failing our men," he began, his voice low but intense. "They are bleeding out during evacuation. Plasma isn't enough. They need whole blood, and they need it now, not in 6 hours." He explained his idea they would find universal donors, men with type O blood from among the lightly wounded or the support staff stationed nearby. They would draw blood directly from the donor into a citrate solution to prevent clotting, and then they would transfuse it immediately into the dying patient. There would be no time for cross-matching. They would rely on the statistical probability that type O blood, the universal donor, would be safe for the vast majority of recipients. The room was silent for a long moment. The risks were staggering. A mismatched transfusion could cause a violent immune reaction, leading to kidney failure, shock, and a painful death. An infection introduced during the process could lead to fatal sepsis. The equipment was rudimentary. They had no proper blood bank refrigerators, no sterile donor sets. They would have to improvise everything. Corporal Miller was the first to speak, his voice hesitant. "Sir, that's against direct orders from the Surgeon General's office. We could be court-martialed. If a patient dies because of the transfusion, they'll charge us with manslaughter." Lieutenant Rosenberg looked at Forrester, her gaze steady. "John," she said, using his first name, a sign of their long professional relationship. "He's right. This is reckless. We're not set up for this. The risk of killing someone is real." Forrester met her eyes. "The risk of letting them die for certain is 100%. "Anna," he replied, his voice grim. "I am not going to stand here and watch another dozen men die today when we have the means to save them right here. I will take full responsibility. The court-martial can have me when this is over, but until then, we are going to save every life we can." He looked at each of them in turn. "I need your help, but I will not order you. This is voluntary." Another heavy silence descended. Then, Private Evans, the youngest of them, nodded slowly. "I'm in. Doc, I'm Type O. You can start with me." One by one, the others agreed. The following day, their first test came. A sergeant from the 16th Infantry was brought in with multiple abdominal wounds from a mortar blast. He had been stabilized surgically, but he had lost too much blood. He was slipping into irreversible shock, his blood pressure plummeting. He was minutes from death. "This is it," Forrester said. He had already pre-screened a dozen willing donors from the engineering unit next door. He selected a burly staff sergeant who had confirmed he was Type O. The setup was crude but functional. Using a sterile needle and tubing, they drew 500 milliliters of blood from the donor, mixing it with a sodium citrate solution in a clean glass flask as it flowed. The donor, pale but determined, sat on a crate, squeezing a rubber ball in his hand. The whole process took less than 10 minutes. Then, they transferred the flask to a stand next to the dying sergeant and connected a fresh tube to the patient's arm. The dark, crimson blood began to flow, drop by slow drop, into the sergeant's vein. The tension in the tent was palpable. Forrester, Rosenberg, and the medics watched, barely breathing. For the first 10 minutes, nothing happened. The sergeant remained deathly still. Then, a faint pinkness began to return to his lips. A few minutes later, his shallow, rapid breathing began to slow and deepen. Forrester checked his pulse. It was stronger, no longer the faint, fluttering thread it had been. After the full pint had been transfused, the sergeant's eyelids fluttered open. He was weak, but he was conscious. He was alive. They had done it. Against all orders, against conventional medical wisdom, they had snatched a man back from the brink. The feeling of triumph was electric, but it was tempered by the knowledge that they had just crossed a Rubicon. There was no going back now. The success with the sergeant was not a fluke. It was a validation. Over the next 48 hours, Captain Forrester and his team performed 11 more direct transfusions. 8 of the recipients showed immediate and dramatic improvement, their vital signs stabilizing, their color returning, their chances of survival skyrocketing. They were stable enough to survive the arduous evacuation to the rear hospitals. 2 patients showed no significant improvement, but, crucially, they did not get worse from the transfusion itself. One soldier, however, did have a reaction. Within minutes of the transfusion starting, he developed a fever and chills, a classic, though not universally fatal, sign of a minor blood type incompatibility. Forrester immediately stopped the transfusion, administered antihistamines, and monitored the man closely. The reaction subsided after an hour. The soldier was weakened, but he was still alive, and his underlying shock had been partially corrected. He, too, survived the journey to the field hospital. For Forrester, this was a critical data point. The reaction was a manageable risk, not a certain death sentence. The balance, in his mind, was clear a high probability of saving a life against a small risk of a manageable complication. The math, in the brutal calculus of the front lines, was undeniable. But the front lines are a small world, and news, especially of the unauthorized and spectacular variety, travels fast. The rumor of a mad doctor in the 1st Division's aid station who was draining blood from healthy soldiers and putting it into dying men began to circulate. By June 12th, the command structure took notice. The response was swift and severe. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Pritchett, the stern, by-the-book commanding officer of the medical battalion, arrived at Forrester's aid station unannounced. He stood at the entrance of the tent, his posture rigid, his face a mask of cold disapproval as he watched Forrester and Nurse Rosenberg oversee the drawing of blood from a private from the Quartermaster Corps, Captain Forrester. Pritchett's voice cut through the low hum of the medical tent, cold and sharp as a scalpel. A word. Now. Forrester finished instructing a medic on applying a pressure bandage to the donor's arm before turning and following the colonel outside, away from the ears of the patients. Would you care to explain to me, Captain, what in God's name you think you are doing? Pritchett began, his voice low and dangerous. I'm saving lives, sir, Forrester replied, his own voice calm but firm. You are practicing reckless, unsanctioned, and forbidden medicine. Pritchett shot back, I have seen your reports. You are performing whole blood transfusions in a forward aid station. You are aware of Surgeon General's circular letter No. 81. You are aware that this procedure is explicitly prohibited forward of a field hospital. I am aware of the letter. Sir, Forrester said, I am also aware that since we began this protocol, the survival rate for severe shock cases in this aid station has increased by an estimated 60%. Men are walking out of here who would have been carried to the morgue. Based on what your gut feeling, Pritchett's tone was scathing. You're using uncross-matched blood. You have no refrigeration, no proper sterile procedure. You're risking fatal hemolytic reactions and septic shock. You're going to kill someone, Captain, if you haven't already. We had one reaction. Sir, it was mild and managed. The patient survived. We have lost 0 patients to the transfusion process itself. We have saved at least 10 who would have certainly died. Forrester met his superior's gaze without flinching. The protocol is the problem. Colonel, it was written for a different war. It doesn't account for the reality of the Normandy battlefield. The evacuation chain is broken. The men are dying in the gap. Your opinion of the protocol is irrelevant, Pritchett snapped. You are an officer in the United States Army, not a freelance savior. You follow orders. I am ordering you, as of this moment, to cease this butchery immediately. You will return to the use of plasma and standard shock treatment only. Is that understood? The word butchery hung in the air between them. An ugly, unjust accusation. Forrester felt a hot flush of anger, but he kept his voice controlled. Sir, with all due respect, I cannot comply with that order. To do so would be to knowingly condemn men to death. My duty as a doctor supersedes my duty to follow an order that is costing lives." Pritchett's eyes widened slightly. Insubordination of this magnitude was rare. "Captain, you're treading on very thin ice. I can have you relieved of command and arrested before sundown." "Then do it, sir," Forrester said, his voice dropping, every word measured. "But when you explain to the next dozen families why their sons and husbands bled to death waiting for a ride, you can tell them it was because you were following the rules." The two men stood in a silent, furious standoff. Pritchett was a bureaucrat, a man who believed in systems and hierarchies. Forrester was a clinician, a man who believed in results. The chasm between them was unbridgeable. Pritchett knew that arresting a decorated surgeon in the middle of the largest invasion in history would be a messy, public affair. The men in the unit, who had seen Forrester's miracles with their own eyes, would riot. "Consider yourself on probation, Captain," Pritchett said finally, his voice tight. "Your every action will be scrutinized. The moment a patient dies because of your protocol, I will personally see you court-martialed and imprisoned. Do I make myself clear?" "Perfectly clear, sir," Forrester said, without another word. Pritchett turned on his heel and strode back to his jeep. Forrester watched him go, knowing the battle was far from over. He had won a temporary reprieve, but the sword was now hanging over his head. He walked back into the tent. Lieutenant Rosenberg looked at him, her eyebrows raised in a silent question. Forrester gave a slight, grim nod. "We continue," he said quietly. And they did. The following week was a relentless trial by fire. The German resistance around Caen was fierce, and a flood of new casualties poured into the aid station. Forrester's team worked around the clock, their transfusion protocol becoming a refined, efficient assembly line of life. They became experts at screening donors, at drawing blood smoothly and quickly, at monitoring recipients for the slightest sign of trouble. They kept meticulous, if unofficial, records. The data was irrefutable. The survival rate for their most critical patients continued to climb. The news, however, could not be contained. Word spread to other aid stations, to other divisions. Curious medics and junior doctors began to appear, asking to see the Forrester method for themselves. At first skeptical, they would watch a pale, nearly lifeless body be transformed after a transfusion, and they would leave as converts. A quiet, underground network began to form. Forrester shared his techniques, his ratios of citrate to blood, his methods for screening donors. He was no longer just a rogue surgeon. He was the leader of a medical insurgency. The final, undeniable validation came on June 20th. A massive counterattack by the Panzer Lehr Division overwhelmed an American position, and the casualties were catastrophic. The main field hospital for the V Corps was itself overrun and had to be hastily evacuated. For hours, the entire medical evacuation system for that sector collapsed. It was the very scenario Forrester had feared, but on a larger scale. Every aid station was inundated with dying men, and in the chaos. Only those stations where surgeons had begun to emulate Forrester's reckless protocol had the tools to fight back. Reports later estimated that hundreds of lives were saved that day in forward aid up and down the line. Not by the official medical doctrine, but by the forbidden technique of forward direct transfusion. The evidence was now too overwhelming, the results too public, to be ignored by the high command. The system had broken. and a lone doctor from Boston, willing to be called reckless, had provided the fix. The storm of the Panzer Lehr counterattack, for all its destruction, had cleared the air. The catastrophic failure of the official medical evacuation system during the crisis was a stain on the record of the senior medical command. They could not ignore the after-action reports that consistently highlighted one glaring anomaly. The aid stations utilizing whole blood transfusions had managed their casualty loads with dramatically lower mortality rates. The evidence was no longer anecdotal, it was statistical, and it was damning to the old protocol. Captain Forrester was not summoned for a court-martial. Instead, a different kind of visitor arrived at his aid station a week later. The man who stepped out of the Jeep was Brigadier General Howard Thayer, the Surgeon General of the European Theater of Operations. He was a tall, lean man with a keen, intelligent face, and he carried an aura of authority that was far more formidable than Lieutenant Colonel Pritchett's rigid bluster. He did not announce his arrival with fury, but with a quiet, observant intensity. He spent 2 hours walking through the aid station, his eyes missing nothing. He watched the donor line, where soldiers waited to give their blood. He observed the careful and efficient process of drawing, citrating, and administering the blood. He spoke quietly with the medics, with Nurse Rosenberg, and with recovering patients who credited the transfusion with saving their lives. Finally, he approached Forrester, who was cleaning his hands in a basin of precious clean water. "Captain Forrester," General Thayer said, his voice neutral, devoid of either praise or condemnation. "Walk with me." They walked away from the tents, toward a copse of trees that had been shattered by artillery, their splintered trunks standing as silent witnesses to the war. "I have spent the morning reviewing your work, Captain," Thayer began. "I have also read Lieutenant Colonel Pritchett's reports. He believes you are a dangerous maverick." Forrester said nothing, waiting for the axe to fall. "I, however," Thayer continued, "have just spent the last week reviewing the casualty figures from the recent offensive. The numbers from units that adopted your method are impossible to ignore. You have demonstrated a profound truth in modern, high-intensity warfare. The luxury of delayed transfusion is a luxury we cannot afford. The old rules were written for a different kind of battle." He stopped walking and turned to face Forrester. "The problem, Captain, is that your system, while effective, is not an army-wide system. It relies on the sheer force of your will and your personal skill. It is not scalable. We cannot have every forward surgeon improvising blood banks with glass flasks and hunches. What we need is a system, a safe, reliable, and standardized system for getting whole blood to the front. You have proven the why. My job is to now create the how." Forrester felt a wave of cautious, overwhelming relief. He was not being court-martialed. He was being heard, effective immediately. General Thayer said, his tone becoming official, "I am issuing a general order rescinding the prohibition on whole blood transfusions forward of field hospitals. Furthermore, I am establishing an ad hoc committee to develop and implement a forward blood transfusion service for the First Army. I want you on that committee. Captain, your practical experience will be invaluable. You will be reassigned to my headquarters at Château de Colombière. You will help us design this new system." It was a total vindication. The reckless protocol was now becoming official doctrine, but Forrester hesitated. He looked back at his aid station, at the muddy, bloody reality of the front line. "General, with respect, my place is here. The men here know the procedure. My team is trained. I can do more good here, and I can continue to provide real-time data to your committee." Thayer studied him for a long moment, a flicker of respect in his eyes. He had expected Forrester to jump at the chance for a safer posting and a promotion. "Stubborn to the end, aren't you, Captain?" "It's not stubbornness, sir. It's where I'm needed." "Very well." Thayer nodded. "Then your aid station will become the prototype, the first official forward blood transfusion unit. You will receive the supplies and support you need, but you will also provide me with detailed daily reports. Every transfusion, every outcome, every complication. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir. Perfectly clear." The change was revolutionary. Within days, the aid station was transformed. Proper donor kits arrived, complete with sterile needles and specially designed bottles with the correct amount of anticoagulant already measured inside. A small, gasoline-powered refrigerator was procured, a miraculous piece of equipment that allowed them to store a small reserve of Type O blood for immediate use. More importantly, the official sanction broke the dam. Medical officers who had been quietly emulating Forrester's methods now did so openly. Teams were dispatched from his station to train others. The Forrester method was refined, standardized, and taught. The system that General Thayer and his committee, heavily influenced by Forrester's reports, eventually built was a masterpiece of military logistics. It started in the rear, in England, where dedicated donor centers collected blood from soldiers and civilians alike. The blood was typed, screened, and flown across the channel in specially designed cold storage containers. In France, it was distributed to mobile blood banks, converted trucks that could travel close to the front. From these trucks, jeeps would carry the life-saving blood in insulated cases to the forward aid stations, just like deliveries of ammunition and rations. The chain was born on the beaches of Normandy, forged in the desperation of a single surgeon, and was now being industrialized for the great push across Europe. For John Forrester, however, the war remained intensely personal. The new supplies and official recognition did not change the fundamental reality of his work: the blood, the pain, the endless procession of shattered young men. One afternoon in late July, a soldier was carried in, his uniform soaked in blood from a chest wound. He was barely conscious, his breathing a wet, ragged gasp. Forrester knew immediately it was a sucking chest wound, and the man had lost a tremendous amount of blood. He was the picture of the very soldier his protocol was designed to save. Type O now. Forrester barked as he worked to seal the wound and insert a chest tube. A medic rushed over with a bottle of blood from their new refrigerator. The transfusion began. Forrester and his team worked with practiced efficiency, but the soldier's condition continued to deteriorate. His blood pressure dropped further. His heart went into a fatal rhythm, and despite all their efforts, despite the whole blood now flowing into his veins, he flatlined. They worked on him for another 20 minutes, but it was futile. He was gone. The silence that fell over the team was heavy. It was always a defeat. Nurse Rosenberg gently pulled a blanket over the soldier's face. Forrester stood back, his shoulders slumping, his hands, once again, stained with blood. This was the other side of his success. For every 10 men they saved, there was still one they could not. The weight of every single loss was a burden that the statistics of his high survival rate could never lift. He had proven his point to the Army. But in this tent, facing this one dead soldier, it felt like a hollow victory. He walked outside, into the fading light, and for a few minutes he was just a doctor who had lost a patient, alone with the cost of his war. The push through France was a brutal, grinding affair, and the forward blood transfusion units moved with the front lines, a silent, life-saving arm of the advancing army. The system that General Thayer had built, fueled by the proof of concept from Forrester's aid station, was now a well-oiled machine. But for Captain John Forrester, the war remained a relentless series of individual tragedies and triumphs, each one etching itself into his memory. The official reports he filed told a story of numbers and procedures, but they could never capture the human reality. In August, during the fierce fighting to close the Falaise Gap, his unit was set up in a shell-blasted farmhouse. The stream of casualties was a torrent. Among them was a young corporal from Texas, his leg nearly severed by a piece of tank shrapnel. A tourniquet had been applied, but he was ghost white, his skin clammy, his eyes wide with the vacant look of profound shock. He was a textbook case for the transfusion protocol. A bottle of O-negative was hung, and the dark red line began to snake into his arm. Forrester worked to clean and debride the mangled limb, preparing for the amputation that was the only way to save the boy's life. As the blood flowed, a remarkable transformation occurred. The corporal's breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, began to slow and deepen. A faint flush of pink returned to his cheeks. His eyes, once glazed over, focused. He looked at Forrester. "Doc," he whispered, his voice raspy but clear. "Am I gonna make it?" Forrester met his gaze, a rare, genuine smile touching his own exhausted eyes. "Son, you're going to be just fine. The worst is over." It was a moment of pure, unadulterated success. The science, the risk, the insubordination, it had all culminated in this one moment where a life was unequivocally snatched back from the abyss. The corporal would lose his leg, but he would go home. He would have a life. These were the moments that fueled Forrester and his team, that made the endless hours and the moral weight bearable. But the war always provided a brutal counterpoint. Just a few hours later, a sergeant was brought in, conscious and alert, complaining of a headache from a concussive blast. He had no visible wounds. He was triaged as a lower priority. While waiting for evaluation, he suddenly slumped over, unconscious. A quick exam revealed a slowly expanding pupil, a sign of massive internal bleeding in the skull, an epidural hematoma. It was a neurosurgical emergency, impossible to treat in a forward aid station. They started a transfusion to stabilize him for the desperate race to a rear hospital, but it was too late. The pressure on his brain was irreversible. He died on the stretcher before the ambulance could even be loaded. The transfusion bottle, still half full, dripped uselessly into a corpse. The sense of futility was crushing. It was a stark reminder that for all their advances, they were still fighting against the fundamental, brutal physics of war, and they could only win the battles that were winnable. By the autumn of 1944, as the Allied advance stalled at the German border and the weather turned, the Medical Corps faced a new enemy complacency. The success of the transfusion program had been so profound that it had become routine. The constant, reliable supply of blood from the rear led some of the newly arrived younger doctors to take the miracle for granted. Forrester saw this one evening when a new transfer, a bright-eyed captain fresh from the States named Dr. Ellis, was preparing to transfuse a patient. Forrester watched as Ellis, humming to himself, began to spike the blood bottle without first checking the patient's tags or the bottle's label against the donor record. It was a small procedural step, But it was the kind of corner-cutting that led to fatal errors. "Stop!" Forrester's voice was quiet but carried the force of a command. Ellis froze. "What is the first step before initiating a transfusion?" "Captain." Ellis looked confused. To hang the bottle." "Sir." Forrester walked over, his face grim. "The first step," he said, his voice low and intense, "is to verify. You verify the patient's identity. You verify the blood type on this bottle. You verify that this blood is intended for this man. This isn't a saline drip. Ellis, this is a substance that can kill as easily as it can save if given to the wrong person. We did not fight the entire United States Army Medical Corps to have you kill a patient through carelessness." The young doctor flushed, chastened. "I'm sorry, sir. It won't happen again." "It had better not," Forrester said, his gaze sweeping over the other staff in the tent. "This protocol was built on a foundation of necessity and discipline. That discipline is what keeps it safe. Never forget that. The moment we start taking this for granted is the moment we become no better than the bureaucracy we had to fight. We are the last line of defense for these men. Act like it." The lesson was learned, not just by Ellis, but by everyone who heard it. Forrester was no longer just a surgeon. He was a keeper of the flame, the guardian of the hard-won standard that had saved thousands. His insistence on rigor, born from the days when a single mistake could have ended his entire experiment, became the cultural bedrock of the forward transfusion teams. As the leaves fell and the cold rains of a European winter began to fall, they knew the war was far from over. The Battle of the Bulge was still to come, a final, brutal test that would push the medical services to their absolute limit. But they were ready, they had the blood, they had the system, and they had the unwavering conviction that had been forged on the sands of Omaha Beach. The Ardennes Offensive, what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, struck with the force of a sledgehammer in the freezing dawn of December 16, 1944. For the medical services, it was their greatest test. The initial German assault shattered American lines, overrunning field hospitals and cutting off entire divisions. The carefully built logistical chain, including the blood supply routes, was severed. Suddenly, the forward blood transfusion units were thrown back into the conditions of their birth isolation, desperation, and a return to improvisation. Forrester's unit, now attached to the 101st Airborne Division, was caught up in the chaotic fight to hold the vital crossroads at Bastogne. They set up their aid station in the cellar of a shattered convent on the town's outskirts. The world above them a hellscape of shelling and close-quarters combat. The temperature plummeted, and with it, a new horror emerged: cold-induced casualties. Men were brought in with severe wounds compounded by deep hypothermia, a combination that was almost universally fatal. The cold shut down circulation, making shock from blood loss even more profound and deadly. Their stock of refrigerated blood, a blessing just weeks before, became a curse. Transfusing a soldier who was near freezing with cold blood could send him into fatal cardiac arrest. They were facing a paradox: the men needed blood to survive their wounds, but the blood itself could kill them. It was a problem the official system had never anticipated. Once again, Forrester and his team had to adapt or watch men die. Lieutenant Rosenberg came up with the solution. "We need to warm it, John," she said, her breath misting in the frigid air of the cellar. "We can't transfuse it cold." "With what?" Forrester gestured around the barren cellar. "We have no warm water baths, no incubators. We're running low on fuel for the stove. "Body heat," she said simply. She took one of the glass blood bottles and, without ceremony, tucked it inside her own uniform against her stomach. "It's not fast, but it's what we have." It became the new, unorthodox procedure. While medics worked to slowly rewarm hypothermic patients with blankets and what little warm fluid they could spare, the blood for their transfusions was warmed against the bodies of the medical staff. Nurses, orderlies, and even lightly wounded soldiers would take turns holding the life-saving bottles under their clothes. Their own body heat slowly bringing the temperature of the blood up to something that wouldn't stop a failing heart. It was a primitive, intimate, and profoundly human solution to a technological problem. The official manual said nothing about using a nurse's torso as an incubator, but in the siege of Bastogne, it worked. The fighting was so intense that the donor pool, the walking wounded, and support staff was stretched thin. One afternoon, a German artillery barrage landed directly outside the convent, sending a shockwave through the cellar and wounding several of the medical staff, including one of their most reliable Type O donors. The supply of universal donor blood, their lifeline, was critically low. A young private with a severe abdominal wound was bleeding out. He needed blood now. The last bottle of O-negative was being warmed. Forrester looked at the desperate situation, then at the donor records. They had a handful of men with other blood types, but using them without cross-matching was a risk they had avoided since the early days in Normandy. But the choice was simple: risk a reaction or guarantee the private's death. "Get me Corporal Jenkins," Forrester ordered. "He's a positive. We'll do a direct donor draw, just like the old days." It was a step back in time, a return to the most basic, risky form of his protocol. They drew the blood from the corporal and, after a swift, crude compatibility test involving mixing a drop of blood and serum on a piece of glass to check for agglutination, they transfused it into the private. The team watched, holding their breath, waiting for a fever or chills that never came. The private stabilized. The gamble had paid off. The siege of Bastogne was the ultimate validation of Forrester's core belief that medical doctrine had to be a guide, not a chains. The will to save a life had to find a way, even if it meant rewriting the rules in a frozen cellar under artillery fire. When the siege was finally broken by Patton's Third Army on December 26th, the cost was staggering. But the survival rate among the critically wounded within the perimeter, against all odds and medical logic, had held firm. The forward transfusion teams, through sheer ingenuity and determination, had beaten the cold, the steel, and the broken supply lines, as the first trucks carrying medical supplies and blood fought their way through to the battered defenders. Forrester looked at the exhausted, grimy faces of his team. They had not just endured. They had advanced the art of battlefield medicine under the worst conditions imaginable. The lessons from the Bulge on warming blood, on flexible typing under duress would be incorporated into the standard protocols, making the entire system more resilient for the final push into Germany. The war was not over, but the battle to save lives had been irrevocably won. The final push into Germany in the spring of 1945 was a stark contrast to the brutal, static warfare of the Bulge. It was a war of movement, and the medical services had to move just as fast. The forward blood transfusion units were now fully integrated into the combat machine, their jeeps and trucks keeping pace with the advancing tanks. For Captain John Forrester, the end of the war brought not a sense of victory, but a deep, profound exhaustion. The constant strain of decision-making, the weight of countless lives saved and lost, had etched itself permanently onto his face and into his soul. He was a master of his craft. But the cost of that mastery had been immense. In April, his unit was operating in a captured German town, its streets littered with the debris of a retreating army. The casualties were a mix of American GIs and surrendering German soldiers. The policy was clear treat all wounded, friend and foe alike. One such case was a young German soldier, no more than 16, who had been caught in a blast. He had a traumatic amputation of his arm and was bleeding profusely. He was pale, shivering, and deep in shock. The familiar, urgent signs were all there. Without a moment's hesitation, Forrester pointed to the boy. "Get him on the table. Hang a unit of O negative. Now." A new medic, fresh from the States, looked at the German uniform, then at Forrester. "Sir, for him." Forrester's head snapped up. His eyes, usually clouded with fatigue, now sharp and blazing. "He's a patient," Forrester said, his voice low and dangerous, devoid of all emotion save a cold, clear intensity. "He is bleeding. He gets the blood. Is that understood?" The medic, chastened, rushed to comply. As they worked to stabilize the boy, Forrester thought of the young lieutenant from Iowa who had bled out in the back of a Jeep on June 8, 1944. He thought of the sergeant from Texas who had lived, and the sergeant with the head injury who had died. He thought of the frozen bottles of blood warmed against his staff's bodies in Bastogne. This protocol, his protocol, was not about nationality or side. It was a line drawn against the void, a simple, unwavering principle if a human being is bleeding to death in front of you. You give them blood. It was the one pure truth he had managed to carve out of the entire, filthy business of war. Saving the young German soldier was not an act of mercy. It was an affirmation of that principle. It was what made all the death, all the fighting, all the bureaucratic battles mean something. When the news of Germany's surrender came on May 8, 1945 VE Day, there were no wild celebrations for Forrester and his team. They were in a field hospital near Leipzig, still processing the wounded from the war's final, spasmodic engagements. That night, someone produced a bottle of whiskey. They passed it around, each taking a small sip. There were no toasts, no speeches. They simply sat together in a weary, comfortable silence, the sounds of the war finally replaced by the sounds of a European spring night. The job was done. Captain John Forrester returned to Boston in the autumn of 1945. He went back to his old position at Massachusetts General Hospital. But the man who returned was not the same one who had left. He was quieter, more withdrawn. He never spoke of the war, never mentioned his role in revolutionizing battlefield medicine. When colleagues asked about his service, he would simply say, "I was a surgeon in Europe," and change the subject. The accolades from the Army, a Distinguished Service Medal that arrived in the mail, a letter of commendation from General Thayer were stored in a box in his attic, unseen. He had no interest in being a hero. He had seen too much for that. He threw himself into his work, becoming one of the leading trauma surgeons in New England. He was known for his incredible speed, his calm under pressure, and his willingness to try unconventional techniques to save a life. But those who worked closely with him also noticed his profound, almost sorrowful respect for blood. He would personally check and double-check every unit of blood before a transfusion, a ritualistic habit born in the aid stations of Normandy and the cellars of Bastogne. It was his way of honoring the sacrifice, both of the donors and of the men who had not made it. The full, public story of the forward transfusion protocol would only be declassified and studied years later, becoming a standard chapter in military medical textbooks. But John Forrester never read them. For him, the legacy was not in the books or the statistics. It was in the quiet, ordinary lives that were lived because of it. It was in the children who were born to fathers who came home, in the grandchildren who knew their grandfathers, in the decades of love and family that were granted because of a few pints of blood given at the right time, in the right place, against all orders. He had learned the hardest lesson of all, that the greatest victories are not those that conquer nations, but those that, piece by piece, life by life, redeem the terrible cost of war. And in the end, for a doctor, that was the only victory that mattered.